BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, and welcome to this special bonus episode of Black Box Online Radio. In this episode I will be discussing John Parr Cox as a Zodiac killer suspect. Most people learn about John Parr Cox because of the channel Real Zodiac Killer Revealed here on YouTube, which is run by Adam Ivester, and the majority of observations that have been made about him in relation to the Zodiac Killer mystery have been made by Adam. But first, I would like to remind you guys that I used to have 3 episodes about John Parr Cox here on BBOR, which have since been deleted, and they were interview segments that had been done with Adam. Back in November of 2023, I did an interview series where I was talking to true crime writers all up and down the spectrum, talking about all types of different cases, but I did do lots of Zodiac Killer interviews. And I did an individual standalone episode, which was an interview with Adam called Zodiac Killer Suspect John Parr Cox. And that was followed by a 2-part Q&A session. I used to give every Zodiac Killer theorist out there a chance to respond to questions and comments that people had in the audience. And the long story short is that Adam requested that those interview segments to be deleted, and I complied with that request. And that's why we are here today. I polled you guys and I asked, would you like to hear an individual suspect profile video on John Parr Cox as a Zodiac suspect? And the majority of people voted for yes. So that's what brings us to this one here. And I have talked about John Parr Cox a lot on the Monday show. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer called Zodiac Monday, and I invite you guys to check that out if you want to follow along with things in the Zodiac Killer mystery. You can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. But I realized that I didn't have an individual standalone episode on John Parr Cox. So let's provide the most basic pieces of information that can be used for an introduction. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. John Parr Cox is a suspect that came onto the radar because Adam began to get curious about some statements that were made by a man who most likely not only saw the Zodiac Killer but also spoke to the Zodiac Killer, and his name is Officer Donald Falk. On October 11th of 1969, the Zodiac Killer committed his final murder, the murder of Paul Stine, the taxi driver, in Presidio Heights in San Francisco. And John Parr Cox lived in the same neighborhood where Paul Stine was murdered. And the famous thing that Adam likes to share is that he lived 80 yards away from the scene of the Stine murder. And not only was Paul Stine murdered, and not only was John Parr Cox living nearby, but the Zodiac Killer was seen walking away from the taxicab by multiple people, Lindsay Robbins and Rebecca Robbins, who provided the information and details that were used in the famous composite sketches of the Zodiac Killer wearing the glasses. But then the Zodiac is walking down the street, and a car passes him with 2 police officers inside, Officer Donald Falk and Officer Eric Selms. Eric Selms would pass away on January 1st of 1970. He was killed in the line of duty. But Officer Donald Falk would go on to appear in multiple pieces of commentary talking about the Zodiac Killer, and one of them was the 2007 documentaries that accompanied the Fincher film, the David Fincher film with Jake Gyllenhaal. And what happened is that Adam became very suspicious of the story that Donald Falk was telling, and he began to look at suspects who lived in the vicinity of Presidio Heights and on the vicinity of the Stine murder, and he found John Parr Cox, and he obtained samples of John Parr Cox's handwriting, and it was extraordinarily similar. And this is a strong point in Adam's defense. I mean, I've said this from the very beginning. I think that John Parr Cox has extremely similar handwriting, and the Zodiac was not only a serial killer, he also wrote letters and cryptograms, taunting messages. He made phone calls. He wrote a message on the car door of 2 of the victims. I mean, the car door was owned by Brian Hartnell. It was Brian Hartnell's car, the surviving victim from Lake Berryessa, but 2 people were attacked on that day, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. But the Zodiac is someone who left messages behind, handwritten messages, and John Parr Cox's handwriting is extremely similar. At, at a superficial stance, that is. I'm not a formal handwriting expert, but I can see the similarities. And then the next point is that the Zodiac killer didn't always spell words correctly. There are numerous misspellings that are littered throughout the Zodiac communications. Some of them are a little bit more obvious, such as misspelling the word Christmas in the debut letter, saying that I'm the murderer of the two teenagers at Lake Herman last Christmas, but he spelled it Christ Mass, Christmass, M-A-S-S at the end. And John Parr Cox was somebody who regularly misspelled words because he had mild dyslexia, and he talked all about this in an interview that he gave in 1986, the same year that Robert Graysmith's Zodiac came out, and it's an interview that was turned into a book. The interview was conducted by Judith K. Dunning, and the book went on to be called Parr Terminal, 50 Years of the Richmond Waterfront. And, I mean, he talks about how he had mild dyslexia, so he would confuse B's and P's, and he would form them into a B and P hybrid. And Adam has found numerous examples on his channel. It goes so far beyond just one type of letter confusion, mixing up B's and P's. I mean, John Parr Cox was an aficionado of Japanese history. He even filled out a form once when he listed his interests and said Japanese history as one of them, but he misspelled the word Japanese on there, and during the interview with Judith K. Dunning, he stated that he misspelled words because he had mild dyslexia. And Soren Korsgaard, author of America's Jack the Ripper, a book about the Zodiac Killer, which I have a standalone episode on as a book discussion here on Black Box Online Radio as well, and I invite you to check that one out if you're curious. But Soren Korsgaard even proposed that hypothesis that he thought that the Zodiac was misspelling these words because of mild dyslexia. Now, that is something that is heavily disputed by a lot of people. Some people think that the misspellings are intentional. Some people think that they are not intentional, like what Adam and Soren would say, that this is the result of some type of medical condition, or just someone is not aware that they are making these types of spelling mistakes. And then there are other people out there that are even more extreme than the ones who just think that the misspellings are intentional. They think that there are secret coded messages that are found within these misspellings, and I'm sure you can think of a few theorists that are coming to mind. My overall take on the subject, though, is I don't believe that the Zodiac was that bad of a speller. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I think that the words were intentionally misspelled for either comedic effect in his own mind. I don't think he really would have been making people laugh by misspelling the word Christmas, but he thought that it was a silly thing to do and it was entertaining to him. And I've talked about this a lot, though, that I think the correct interpretation of the evidence is found in Stefan Nyberg's essay concerning the Exorcist letter, when he looks at the Zodiac killer's Exorcist letter, and the Zodiac misspelled the words satirical and comedy. The opening line is, I saw him think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy ever. And he mixes up the spellings of satirical and comedy, like the I from satirical goes into the word comedy, and the E from comedy goes into the word satirical. And it's perhaps just that. He was doing something that he thought was comedic. It was comedic to him, even though other people probably wouldn't be laughing about it. But, I mean, that's what serial killers do. They do things that fuel their own excitement, neurologically speaking. Just giving my take on that particular subject. But I have to confess that John Parr Cox has extremely similar handwriting. John Parr Cox was also somebody that exhibited some behaviors that are rather consistent with that of serial killers, or there's certain examples of serial killers that actually have these types of behaviors. One of them would be impersonating police officers. The Zodiac killer committed the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, and the person who approached the car there where Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau was sitting apparently made Mike Mageau think that he was a police officer. He heard the person walking up, and Mike Mageau said something to the effect of to get the wallets out so they could show the IDs because they thought that a police officer was approaching them. And now, we don't necessarily know who the Zodiac killer was, but John Parr Cox did talk about this exact type of behavior, about knowing how to walk and act like a police officer, knowing how to put on the facade of being a police officer, And the thing that Adam likes to share is that it is not uncommon for serial killers to pretend to be a police officer. He talks about how Ted Bundy did it before. Or another example that just came to mind right now, David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, would try and lure sex workers back to his, well, dungeon of torture, and he would pretend to be an undercover police officer. This happens from time to time with serial killers. But what John Parr Cox said, though, during his interview with Judith K. Dunning was that he learned how to mimic the mannerisms and walking gait and persona of being a police officer. He could even walk up to people that were parked in cars, and he would kind of scare them away by thinking that he was a police officer. It even got to the point where he could walk into a bar and then he ordered a drink and somebody said, "Don't worry, it's on the house, Sarge," thinking that he was a police sergeant because he knew how to mimic the mannerisms of a police officer. So there are certain types of behaviors that John Parr Cox is exhibiting that are not completely out of realm and out of reach for being a serial killer. Some background info, though, on John Parr Cox. He was born in 1918. His birthday was in November, so he would have been 50 years old for the entirety of Zodiac activity. You might find some people on forums talking about how he was 51, but the Zodiac started committing murders on December 20th of 1968 and then concluded on October 11th of 1969. So everything is happening within a 12-month cycle of John Parr Cox's life. He was not 51, he was 50 years old during all of those crimes, and he was someone who lived through World War II, but it's my understanding that he was not a World War II veteran, and I hope I don't mistake this, but he was stateside, and he actually began helping the Japanese Americans, and that's what started this infatuation with Japanese history. He was somebody who organized things to help the Japanese Americans here on the state side, particularly in California. And this ties into Adam's theory involving the Zodiac killer, actually, because this whole thing about impersonating police officers, but also not trusting them, because the Zodiac killer is saying a lot of things that are very anti-police officer. He calls them pigs. He calls them blue meanies. He is insulting them. He's saying that they aren't as clever as he is. And John Parr Cox allegedly developed a distrust of the police officers because he saw how the Japanese were mistreated during World War II, and there's of course the internment, but just the overall anti-Japanese sentiment. And John Parr Cox was not only somebody who helped out Japanese Americans, he was actually given the highest civilian honor that a foreigner can receive in Japan from the emperor, for just not only his efforts helping the Japanese during World War II, Japanese Americans, excuse me, but also for his passions about Japanese history. And Adam likes to say that he was a Nippanophile, meaning that he was just someone who was very passionate about Japanese culture. Now, this ties into something else in the Zodiac Killer mystery, because there was a costume that was worn by the Zodiac Killer at Lake Berryessa. On September 27th of 1969, the Zodiac Killer attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa. He was wearing a black hooded costume that had clip-on sunglasses. A slit was cut for the mouth, and he was wearing a type of dicky flap on the costume that went down over the chest almost to the waist, but not quite to the waist, and there was a white circle with a cross going through it that was sewn on to the costume, and it appeared that it was done with care and precision, the famous Lake Berryessa costume. And Adam is, again, the first person that I've heard to find this, that there were similar masks that were worn in Japanese kabuki theater. And kabuki theater was performed in San Francisco at the time. There was even a performance going on of Kushigara, a Japanese play called Kushigara, that would have been very close to Mason and Geary, where the Zodiac got into the taxicab that was driven by Paul Stein, the final victim. So that is another place where John Parr Cox could have been. But just talking about Lake Berryessa for a second, that could have been the inspiration for the Lake Berryessa hood, or even a step further, that the Lake Berryessa hood was actually made by modifying a Japanese kabuki theater stagehand mask. And is, if I can understand this course of events, the reason why they wear these types of masks is when they're moving things around and they're trying to move different props on the set, it's almost adding an aesthetic to the play. So they're not looking at a human being moving stuff. They're just going to see this type of black outline. If they see anything at all, maybe they wouldn't even be noticed, depending on how dark the theater was. And Adam also talks about how the Zodiac killer tied up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard with a clothesline-style rope, and clothesline-style rope was used in kabuki theater to pull larger set objects, to pull larger pieces of the set during the set changes. So that could be another thing that ties it all together, excuse that terrible expression, about how and why the Zodiac is approaching people with these items at Lake Berryessa, or where they were taken from. So those are some strong points in favor of John Parr Cox being the Zodiac killer. This is a neutral point. John Parr Cox was one of the wealthier Zodiac killer suspects out there. Maybe not the wealthiest. I mean, it's really hard to top an individual like Shel Cavalli, who lived very close by to John Parr Cox. He was the auto tycoon, the importer of automobiles, one of the leading importers of Volkswagen on the West Coast in the United States, a very affluent businessman. But John Parr Cox ran more or less the Richmond waterfront. He ran Parr Terminal, hence the name, and he was somebody who, perhaps we can call him a transportation executive. We can call him somebody who was, again, a very affluent businessman, somebody who would have lunch with the mayor and the chief of police, somebody who owned a private hunting island, where he was a participant in hunting activities on the private island. I take it back. I shouldn't have called him the owner. He hunted on a private hunting island called Brooks Island with the famous entertainer Bing Crosby, and then Vic from Trader Vic's, and then they're just hanging out with the Zodiac killer, allegedly. And there was an issue that took place. There was an article that Adam found from September of 1968, and going off of memory, I believe that the date that it was printed was September 17th of 1968, stating that the lease on Brooks Island, the private hunting reserve that John Parr Cox used, was going to expire, and there was going to be a forced sale of the island to the government. And then that would have been 3 months prior to the Lake Herman Road murders. And Adam hypothesized that John Parr Cox would have been extremely frustrated about that, or even if he's not extremely frustrated, the idea came to mind that what if he were to hunt people for sport? Because there is the story of The Most Dangerous Game, which tells the story of someone who does just that, hunting people for sport. And it has been made into multiple movies, and I mean, not only The Most Dangerous Game movie, but also the film Bloodlust from 1961. And this is one that was heavily disputed online because, giving a shout out to Holly Toski, who really wanted to challenge Adam on this by looking at this theory that there was a forced sale of the island on more or less December 20th of 1968, the date of the Zodiac killer's first confirmed crime, the Lake Herman Road murders. And Holly Toski, the niece of Dave Toski, the detective in the Zodiac case, went through a lot of the newspaper articles and archives, and she actually found out that there was no forced sale that took place on December 20th of 1968, and the lease on Brooks Island, if I'm using the term correctly, continued on for years afterward. By years, I believe it's between 1 and 3 years after December 20th of 1968. So more or less, whatever type of forced sale that was supposed to take place didn't happen. And Adam simply responded by saying, well, that doesn't really change anything, because if there is this article saying that there's going to be a forced sale in September of 1968, he could have thought that that was a possibility, and that wouldn't change the hypothesis at all, that some way, somehow in his mind, he conceived that he was going to launch this plan to hunt people for sport. And I completely follow both lines of thinking, and sometimes you can enter into a point where people are sharing different ideas and they don't necessarily contradict, except I would give Holly credit for pointing out that the forced sale did not take place on December 20th of 1968, the way that not only Adam but also I have stated here on Black Box Online Radio, giving credit where credit is due. So that's another issue that we can dispute and explore. But then the biggest pieces of commentary and criticism and challenges that Adam experiences when he's talking about John Parr Cox as a Zodiac suspect boil down to his physical description, boil down to biometrics, and just his overall appearance. Now, this is something that not a lot of people know, but the Zodiac Killer channel used to do the Interview with the Expert series and the three-part documentary series Obsession into Darkness and numerous other videos on suspect profiles and letter analyses, and it has recently been shut down. And there was one interview with the experts that never aired, and that was one that was recorded with Adam Ivester. It was recorded in the spring of 2023, and it kind of came out of the blue, to be honest, and more or less, it was never aired. It is the true lost episode to the Interview with the Expert series. The Zodiac Killer channel has now been shut down, but I interviewed Adam Ivester for that channel, and we were just talking about all of these observations that he made, and it was more or less just something that did not get to be aired. So, I mean, I guess it's going to ever remain a mystery, all of the back and forth discussions that we had for that one, and that's why people seem to notice that when I was talking to Adam during our interviews last November, they said that I just seemed a little bit different and I couldn't really tell what I was thinking. And for a lot of that, it was because I knew what Adam was going to say, because the actual raw moments and my initial reactions and my genuine first takes on the subject were all encapsulated in that interview that was done for the Zodiac Killer channel, which most likely will never air. But that is the first time that I actually heard from Adam all of the details about John Parr Cox and his physical stature. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, he weighed 245 pounds, and he is someone who is definitely an older suspect. 50 years old doesn't completely eliminate somebody as a suspect. As I said, there's a widely discussed suspect named Shel Cavalli, who is more or less championed by Mike Rodelli, author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo. But if I recall, Holly Tosky, whom I just cited right now, is also a proponent of that theory and has agreed that Shel Cavalli is a likely Zodiac Killer suspect. He is her suspect as well. But with John Parr Cox, it's the size that throws a lot of people off. 6 feet 4 inches tall, 245 pounds. I was forced to admit that that is contradictory to the forensic evidence, to the witness statements, to the witness descriptions. My immediate response during that interview that I did with Adam was, well, now how exactly would that work? The people who actually saw the Zodiac Killer were Donald Falk, the Robbins kids, Mike Mageau, the surviving witness from the Blue Rock Springs shooting, and the Robbins kids and Mike Mageau said that they thought that this person was 5 feet 8 inches tall. They estimated that he was 5 foot 8, and your suspect is 6 foot 4. Like, how on earth would that work? And Adam's simple response was that eyewitness testimony is horribly unreliable. Mike Mageau was being shot at. He had bullets going through his body. He wasn't trying to memorize the person's height, and he wasn't even probably aware of what was going on. Fair enough. And the Robbins kids saw the person from a distance. They're looking out a window, and again, that alters the perception of somebody's height. And Officer Falk has already been proven to be unreliable in Adam's theory. So he's just saying that the eyewitness descriptions from those people are not things that we should take to the bank. But then what would we make of the eyewitness descriptions from Lake Berryessa, where the Zodiac Killer had a conversation with people, perhaps up to 15 minutes, where he's talking to Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard? And Brian Hartnell was a very tall individual himself. He was around 6'6" or 6'7", and he said that he wasn't a very good judge of height because of his own height, because he's just so much taller than everyone else. And again, to share my honest take on the subject, Cecilia Shepard was able to give testimony before she passed away, and she estimated the height of the perpetrator to be 6 feet tall. That's 4 inches shorter than John Parr Cox. Adam likes to zone in on one statement from Brian Hartnell where he said that it was estimated that the killer was 6 foot or better. Brian Hartnell said that the Zodiac was 6 foot or better, maybe. Brian Hartnell, as previously stated, said he was a bad judge of height, though. But 6 foot or better could mean somebody that was 6'4". But I have to be very honest with you. John Parr Cox was 6 feet 5 inches tall. He lost an inch of his height because of back surgery. But if he had been wearing that costume at Lake Berryessa, the Lake Berryessa hood, and maybe even a wig under the hood, we don't necessarily know, but the Zodiac was reported to have had a head of dark brown hair from Cecilia Shepard, who saw him put the mask on from a substantial distance. She couldn't make out any discernible features other than he was a Caucasian male with brown hair. Then, I mean, if he were 6'4" and wearing that costume, he would have appeared to have been 6'5", 6'6", maybe even 6'7". And I think the witness description, again, emphasis on I think Brian Hartnell would have said, well, he was just about as tall as I was. He was maybe just about 6'5", 6'6", or 6'7", just about as tall as I was. I don't think that John Parr Cox would have appeared to have been 6 feet 7 inches tall in the Lake Berryessa hood. But there's another piece of contradictory evidence, and that is that John Parr Cox weighed 245 pounds, and the foot impressions at Lake Berryessa were documented very clearly. They made a whole line of prints going from the tree line to the picnic blanket where Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked, and then back to the Carmen Kia where the Zodiac wrote a message on the car door. And the forensic examiner, Hal Snook, forensic investigator, determined that the estimation for the weight of the Zodiac should be between 200 and 225 pounds, so that's a full 20 pounds lighter than John Parr Cox, although weight can fluctuate over time, not to mention the fact that John Parr Cox definitely does have a broader and heavier looking face. The face of a heavier set man than that of the Zodiac killer, because the Zodiac after Presidio Heights has a very narrow pointed jawline, like his cheekbones go outward, and then the jawline is not quite chiseled, but almost chiseled, and it forms into a very sharp point. And I haven't seen that in any of the photos of John Parr Cox. But where I tried to give credit to Adam was, John Parr Cox does resemble the aged composite when you bring the composite to life, either using CGI or just colorizing it with computer graphics. That does resemble John Parr Cox a little bit. I repeat, a little bit. But definitely it looks like somebody who weighs less than 245 pounds. That's my take on the subject. Adam has also provided the explanation that the guy was 6'4". He wasn't Robert Wadlow, somebody like 8 feet 11 inches tall. And I'm forced to admit as well, yes, he wasn't as tall as Robert Wadlow, and Robert Wadlow was almost 9 feet tall, as you just heard, 8 feet 11 inches tall, the Alton Giant. But I think that is an irrelevant example because that doesn't necessarily change anything. I think that we have to face the facts and just look at how John Parr Cox is contrary to a lot of the witness descriptions. And in the past, I really was very curious about John Parr Cox as a Zodiac killer suspect. I thought that, well, I just wanted to see how far Adam could go with this. I thought that he was thinking in a very different way. I thought he was using all types of outside-of-the-box research methods. Maybe he was onto something. But when I learned about all of these physical characteristics of John Parr Cox, he really began to plummet in the suspect ratings, because you just have to look at them as facts, that he is contrary, his physical appearance is contrary to that of the witness statements and the forensic estimations. And during the Q&A session that I did with Adam, where he could respond to the questions and comments from the first interview that I aired on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, I just read off a comment from one of you guys and said, "What was John Parr Cox's shoe size?" And Adam said something to the effect of, "This is all coming back to the height and weight, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, but it's a fair question. What was his shoe size?" Because the shoe size, again, was documented from the footprints at Lake Berryessa that were walking toward Brian Hartnell's car door, and they were of a 10.5 size wing walker. And, well, did John Parr Cox wear a size 10.5? I mean, what was his shoe size? And I didn't see any reason for Adam to be defensive on that, because it's a legitimate question when you're actually trying to get to the truth in a murder mystery. So I know Adam was thinking that people are just zoning in on this height and weight thing too much. I mean, he thinks that the other pieces of evidence are much more valuable, such as the similarities in handwriting, the mild dyslexia, the origin of the Lake Berryessa costume. He thinks that those things outweigh the physicalities, but I personally do not. I mean, you just have to look at how this guy was perhaps too big to be the Zodiac killer. But what do you think? You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And to be fair, I don't know John Parr Cox's shoe size, and that was one thing where we didn't get a direct answer to. But the more important aspect of that is that somebody can make their shoes appear larger, right? I mean, they could wear shoes that are too big for them by putting stuff in the toe of the boot or something like that. But to make your feet appear smaller, that's perhaps a little bit more difficult. Even Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, would cut off the soles of other boots and shoes and glue them onto a different pair, so it would leave a different type of footprint. A very meticulous individual. But normally people don't make their feet appear smaller when they're doing something like that. It would either be the same size or bigger. Now, though that's just what I think happened, it's another strike against John Parr Cox as the Zodiac killer. And there are other pieces of evidence that Adam does explore, and you can visit his channel, Real Zodiac Killer Revealed, where he goes through all of them, looking at pre-Zodiac crimes that could be connected to John Parr Cox, post-Zodiac crimes that could be connected to John Parr Cox. But we haven't really talked about the letters and the ciphers too much. And earlier today on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, I shared the Zodiac Killer news report from November 27th of 2024, and that's where I shared perhaps the only surviving interview clip from my discussions with Adam about his Zodiac killer suspect, John Parr Cox. And it was a very specific segment. It was about 8 to 10 minutes long, where we were discussing the Z13 cipher. The Z13 was the Zodiac killer's final confirmed cipher. The Zodiac created the Z408, which has been solved, the Z340, which has been solved, the Z13, and the Z32. The Z13 is referred to as the My Name Is cipher. And Adam has a very simple solution for the Zodiac's Z13 cipher, which uses what Adam calls the simple substitution cipher, a simple cipher solution. It goes in direct order, and it's X space JON for John space P space dot Cox dot. And this is another thing that I heard for the first time in the interview that I did with him for the Interview with the Expert series that would have never been aired. And he was looking at that and thought, it's kind of odd that this would work out in this way, John P. Cox. But do people actually write their names like that? Yeah, you put a period after the middle initial, but at the end of the name too. And then he found a document that had John Parr Cox's name on, written John P. Cox. He did write his name that way. That is another piece of supporting evidence. The problems that I have with Adam's solution to the Z13 cipher are that, number one, he has to begin with the letter X to make what he calls the simple substitution cipher work, and also that there is a space that is out of order in what I believe should be, the correct order should be P dot space Cox dot, and then that should be the ending. But instead there's a space before one of the dots, and I don't necessarily think that fits with what Adam is trying to say, because Adam has been in an extremely loud voice, and this is actually one of the reasons why we had to part ways, because of these types of disagreements, not on YouTube or anything, but because of comments that he was making on different forms of social media, just getting very upset about people who are looking at different ways of solving the Zodiac ciphers. And Adam says some very strong things in response. Number one, a cipher has rules, and that there are certain rules and principles in a cipher that have to be followed. Number two, that the NSA believes that it is a simple cipher substitution, or simple substitution cipher going in order. And the reason why there's an X at the beginning is you provided him with this terminology during the Interview with the Expert series. I'm sure Adam knew what it was, but just kind of connecting the dots as we spoke. When you sign your name on a document, there is a signature line that has an X and then a line, and you can sign your name there. And the X is the signature line. That's what it's meant to symbolize. But a fact is a fact once again, and it means that X John P space dot Cox space P space dot Cox dot, that doesn't necessarily match up either, because you have to give the condition that the Zodiac wanted to write his name on a quote-unquote signature line, and then you also have the misspelling of the name John, and Adam's explanation is that, well, the name John is written Jon in Japanese, and John Parr Cox was very passionate about Japanese culture and history, and then you would have the space that and the dot, which should be reversed in my opinion. So I think that there are just too many irregularities with Adam's solution to the Z13. And I can also be very honest with you right now. Is this really what the Zodiac intended for us to find, the X meaning the signature line? I don't believe so. I can comprehend what Adam is saying, but just because I can follow somebody's ideas in their own sequence that they have created doesn't mean it's exactly what the Zodiac Killer laid out. And I think that there are too many rough parts in Adam's solution to the Z13. I can see where it's stitched together just to try and make this particular theory work. So overall, no, I don't think this is exactly what the Zodiac Killer intended. And here is another point. No matter whom your Zodiac Killer suspect is, I don't think that it is necessarily a simple cipher substitution that has to go from left to right like the English language. I don't care what the NSA has said. They haven't solved the cipher to the best of our knowledge. And more importantly, a criminal who is composing a cipher does not have to use cipher rules. This whole thing about a cipher having rules, people can put whatever they want in their own encrypted, encoded message. I mean, you could make a cipher that has wildcard symbols that have multiple meanings if you wanted to. You could make a hidden message that has something that is extremely personal to you. You could have a hidden message where each symbol reveals a set of words, one word leading to another word. You can do whatever you want with your own type of cryptic creations. So I don't believe that a cipher has to follow a certain set of rules when it's created by a criminal serial killer. I just don't accept that. And more or less, I'm going to get to the end of today's video just by saying John Parr Cox is a suspect whom I strongly consider a lot of Zodiac Killer suspects, but this is one that really went down for me because of the biometrics and all of the things I said about ciphers. But the cipher doesn't necessarily mean anything about him being the Zodiac Killer. If I disagree with Adam's solution to the Z13, that doesn't change whether or not this person committed the murders. I think what goes against him on that is the height, the weight, physical appearances, as well as all of the strong points. This is another bold statement. All of the strong points in favor of John Parr Cox being the Zodiac Killer are mostly tied to the letters, the similarities in handwriting, having mild dyslexia, and other points that Adam has brought up on his channel about using similar language in his letters that he has found from the Judith K. Dunning interview, Parr Terminal. All of that stuff really shows that John Parr Cox could only work as a suspect for writing the letters in my mind. And as a Zodiac Killer suspect by himself, I would give him a 4 out of 10 chance, 4 out of 10 for being the Zodiac Killer, because he doesn't match the witness descriptions and the physicalities and the biometrics and the body type and the height and weight. All of that stuff appears to be contrary to what we have to go with. But in terms of writing the letters, I do see the similarities. And I don't necessarily know if that's what happened, that there was a separate killer and a separate letter writer. I'm just giving you my take on the subject. I think that everything points away from him being the Zodiac, and the creation of the letters, we don't necessarily know. But what do you think about John Parr Cox as a Zodiac Killer suspect? What do you think about anything that I've said about the ciphers, about how the Z13 does not have to go in some type of linguistic sequential order where everything has to match up in a simple substitution cipher where the A has to represent this symbol, the E has to represent this symbol, the N has to represent this symbol? What do you think about that? Do you think the cipher has to have the rules or it does not have to have the rules? And if you want to hear more about the evidence for John Parr Cox being the Zodiac Killer one more time, you can go over to Real Zodiac Killer Revealed. That is the channel that is run by Adam. Again, he's the loudest voice about John Parr Cox being the Zodiac. And please share anything you want in the comments section down below. And one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I'll see you over on Zodiac Monday. Goodbye.